Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another speaker in our Curious Minds author series. And today we have author Susan Wolff Murphy from Texas A&M Corpus Christi on hand. And I'd like to introduce her. Again, this is part of our Curious Minds series. This has, in the past, of course, been on campus, and in the future will be so again. And there you can see some pictures of our gloriously beautiful campus and some of the previous events so well attended on the screen. And thank you for coming today. My name is John Barr, and I'm a history professor at Lone Star College-Kingwood, and we appreciate your listening in on today's session. This series, our Curious Minds series, is premised on one simple idea, and that idea is, as the author Gerald Graff once said, that talking about books or ideas is as important educationally as are the books and the subjects themselves. In a week, on Friday, March the 4th, we will have a book discussion of Dorian Lynskey's book, The Ministry of Truth, the biography of George Orwell's 1984. As with today, this will take place on a Friday and at 12:30 in the afternoon. So please join us then for that book discussion. It should be a lot of fun. But today we have Susan Wolff Murphy on hand, and she's going to speak on her book, Border Writers, LatinX Identities and Literary Practices at Hispanic-Serving Institutions. And she'll talk about 40 minutes or so and then take questions and answers for 15 to 20 minutes. As she talks, consider these questions. What was your experience as a college student? Were you first generation? Do you identify with a marginalized group? What made you feel welcomed or excluded? What's your experience with language and literacy? For example, are you bilingual or multilingual? Does your family speak a language other than English? What role has literacy played in your history or your family's history? In what ways can you use formal or informal writing and or discussion to be inclusive with others in your life? If you are a teacher and or professor, what about in your classroom? The chapters in her book talk about methods of teaching and writing, but in your life or your discipline or your future classroom, how could you do or encourage what she calls polyvocality and creative responses to our diverse experiences and spaces? And in what ways can you invite the community into your teaching if you're a professor? Or how could professors better encourage students to do work that is applied or can be applied in a public community or space? So during the talk, think about these questions, and any questions that you might have, type them into the chat box, which is in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, and then I'll cut and paste them into the chat box for everyone to see. And afterwards, we'll have student, faculty, staff, and community members ask questions, and Susan will answer those questions. So without any further ado, Susan Wolff Murphy is an associate professor of English at Texas A&M University-Corpus Christi. She is the co-editor with Christina Kirklider and Diana Cardenas of Teaching, Writing with Latina Students, Lessons Learned at Hispanic-Serving Institutions. And today, the book she's going to talk about, Border Writers, Latinx Practices, and Literacy at Hispanic-Serving Institutions, co-edited with Isabel Baca and Yndalecio Isaac Hinojosa. So Susan, thank you and welcome.
Anti-racist is something that never really ends, that there's never a point of arrival. And she talks about the importance of reflecting on her identity and just constantly self-examining what she does and her own positionality. And I was recently in a research talk with a colleague who was talking about our identities and the identities of our subjects in research, and how we need to navigate those dynamics, like who are we recruiting for our research, what are our topics of research, and why are we choosing them, both in ways that might exclude people but also include people, but in relationship to our own identities. And so I just think it's important, especially for our future teachers in the audience, to just recognize that we all are navigating various identities, various parts of our identities when we're in the classrooms, and the identities of all of our students. And none of that is fixed, right? Those are all in motion. They're all in process. So I just wanted to start with that. Okay, so why we took on these projects, these books, and especially the second book, has a lot to do with demographic. Yes, there we go. Ta-da! The demographic changes in the United States and in Texas, which were also true to a lesser degree with the publication of the first book. Rising numbers of Latino, Latina, Latinx students in higher education, in K-12, and then obviously in higher education. I think most of us know that the US Census showed that 95% of Texas growth was in people of color since 2010. And you can see the percentages for that. And 44% of that growth was urban. So those of you who are teaching in Houston in Harris County probably are intimately familiar with the demographics and the diversity. Houston in particular is incredibly diverse, and not just diverse with a couple populations, but diverse with many populations, right? So I don't, this is, you know, really important in the spaces that you're teaching in. So we saw you know, the shifting of the population and languages that are showing up in our classrooms, and how the country and the state are really changing, and thinking about, like, well, how should we respond to that? And some campuses have been serving diverse populations for many years. Other campuses really haven't, and then might be facing challenges that they haven't really encountered. And the other thing that we find down here in South Texas that you probably also get in Houston is hiring faculty from other parts of the country who come to our campuses and maybe aren't familiar with the cultures that we're serving. And so we try to orient those faculty to the environment that they're coming into. In addition to the demographic changes, we all have, and you just mentioned Ukraine this morning, which is a whole nother trauma I could have added to this slide, but it was, you know, we've had the Black Lives Matter movement, we've had the Me Too movement, we've had the pandemic going on. So our culture as a whole has really been rocked by these crises and pressures for cultural change. And I think that these events, these processes have really changed the attitudes of our students. Maybe not just the attitudes, maybe attitudes is a wrong word, maybe their way of functioning in the world, and in some senses, like what their expectations for things are. In addition, I think our colleagues have changed as well, and we need to think about how we're responding as institutions and as faculty. How are we learning from these events and these things that are happening? So what we hope to accomplish was helping faculty and institutions respond to these changes, both the demographic and the social and cultural changes, and really help to prevent bias in our classrooms. Because bias, even if it's unconscious bias, is a part of how institutional racism occurs, right? And so in a writing classroom, or in many higher ed classrooms when we are assigning writing, one of the most basic ways that students can feel included or excluded is, and I'm going to talk about this anyway, but the acceptance of their language or their way of speaking or writing, and how that's responded to. And so that was probably our primary goal. And I think since the publication of the book and the rise of the Black Lives Matter, it sort of expanded in my mind beyond LatinX, although we were focused on that with our particular demographic and talking about the border and borderedness, to more broadly students of color, first generation, students whose identity, who might feel like they are not welcomed, like I said, into higher education, for lack of a better word. So there has been a fair amount of discussion in a lot of parts of higher education about racism and anti-racist work and decolonializing, and how can we accomplish that in our various disciplines. I'm gonna, I think, skip through here and then come back maybe to questions. All right, so I decided I didn't like the order of my slides, so I'm skipping ahead and then I'll go back. I think I already sort of said this, but one of the reasons that I am constantly talking about language and identity with writing is that they are so interconnected. And this is something that linguists have known for forever. Basically, as children grow up, we acquire language and we build language with the processes of building our identity. So our home language is tightly connected to who we are at our core, who we are at our earliest memories. And as we layer on top of that, say, coming to school and learning to write, and learning other varieties of languages or other languages, we layer those on top of that core identity. And so writing and speaking and language are always connected to our identities. And then and in general, in culture, attitudes about languages or language varieties is always a reflection of this person speaking that language or variety. So oftentimes prejudice towards an identity is actually identified as prejudice towards a language variety. And so that can be a disguise for certain forms of prejudice or racism. And I borrowed the little meme to talk about how hierarchical and conservative higher ed it can be, even though we like to think of ourselves as very liberal and progressive. So one of the things that I wanted to just say again is that all of this work is kind of scary and dangerous to talk about and seems very risky. It doesn't seem, it is risky. So I just want to acknowledge that again. So one of the concepts of the book is the idea of borderedness, or bordered writers, our title, bordered writers. And so we use that term very deliberately to talk about it as an act, being bordered, having a border imposed upon you, the act of living in a border. It is a concrete reality, and it is also a constructed reality, right? And when you take it beyond an actual physical border, it is inclusive of many other kinds of identities and realities. And so that's why on this slide, I'm talking about intersectionality, right? I have a picture of the actual border and art from the border, but there's also other ways that people are bordered, and I didn't want to leave that out. I talked about lived experiences of the border, also linguistic experiences, meaning like different languages coming together, different language varieties coming together in different ways, and different literacies that are valued, that interact with each other. So these all play on this idea of borderedness and being bordered. So student writers are bordered because they can be bordered both because they live in a border. They have an actual concrete experience of the border. In many of the chapters of the book, they're talking about students that cross the border to come to school or live on the border, or live in a house where the language at home is different than the language at school, and that's a kind of a border. But there's also the construction of borders, or the constructed spaces where certain languages and bodies don't feel welcome in higher education or academic spaces. And so that goes to this idea of the constructedness of these things. And this idea of bordered subjectivities, right? That this is the identities that have come out of these experiences. Horner and Trimber talk about how first-year composition enacts what they call unidirectional monolingualism, which is a lot of syllables, but it means one direction towards one language, right? Unidirectional monolingualism. In other words, the goal of education is to move students from wherever they come from to English, meaning, and to a standard American edited English. That's true in first year writing, it's true in K-12, and it's true in a lot of other classrooms. And that movement judges or seems to dismiss the other forms of language and language varieties that might exist in that student's experience. So I think that's as far as I'm going to go with that. But the we can come back to that, because one of the things that we're talking about with a lot of these chapters is getting away from that idea of the default action is to move students towards standard American edited English, and that we can consider different options, right? Or are there adds, are there additions, so that the classroom is not just a space of one variety of one language, but it might provide opportunities for other things. And that we don't just assume that one thing is correct and dominant. Okay. One of the things that, one of the reasons for the book is that we are a Hispanic-serving institution, and many of our institutions are Hispanic-serving or minority-serving institutions. And one of the interesting things that we were trying to contribute to, and one of the things that we kept in mind was trying to avoid these different versions of narratives that tend to cluster around Hispanic-serving institutions. Either the salvation narrative of we're going to save the at-risk student, the deficit student, or the at-risk deficit narrative about students, that these are bad students and underprepared. And I myself have had plenty of conversations where I was involved in that conversation, where I use those terminology. And again, I feel like it's some of my attempt at growth to try to get away from these narratives and understand that these narratives are not helpful, they're damaging, and that we need to find other ways. We need to not work towards that sort of a cultural version of that unidirectional monolingualism, moving everyone to a dominant norm or a standard of whiteness. And I want to get the opportunity to talk about a different book. This is also a book that you might consider reading, Becoming Hispanic-Serving Institutions by Gina Ann Garcia. She has a really interesting conversation about some of this. And I have it in I think I have it in my references, but I'll certainly send it to everyone. And she makes some really interesting arguments about Hispanic serving institutions and our function in higher ed, and how HSIs themselves, and because of how we're categorized and ranked, well, she doesn't say might, she says do feed into a narrative of white dominance, but that is not my talk. That would be her talk. But all right. So I think I've already said this, but we are walking a fine line between looking at concrete and material and lived experiences of borderedness, and whoops, I have a typo, and questioning the essentialized nature of ethnic and racial and other identities, right? So there's, it's important to acknowledge that both of these things are true at the same time, and that we kind of have a balance, right? That we're in the middle here. We don't want to dismiss one or the other. I think, oh, I said that already. So borderedness is enacted upon people. And one other thing that I need to say is that being bordered or borderedness, being bordered is usually an act of violence, right? So if you think about a border, that's you think about our national border, our Mexico-United States border, right? And think about it as how it is a place where it's heavily policed, where we have the military down there guarding it. We have people dying all the time at the border. It's a very violent, it's a situation of violence, right? It's not something that can be lightly just thrown around. It's important to remember that. And there are concrete and serious repercussions to this borderedness. At the same time, or maybe because of the violence, people respond to this, and they can respond in very creative ways. And some of the book chapters talk about this, and Lorenzo Dua talked about this, right? About this space between as being generative, right? That it generates creativity because you're operating in multiple languages and multiple cultures, and you have this really dynamic set of pressures and existence that's going on at the border. So one of the things I wanted to share was this art, which is a piece of an exhibition that I saw recently. And these tapestries are fabric with textile borders and print. And you can see the bridge and the border fence. And there are some people walking or standing by the fence. And then there's some print on the tapestry. And the print, which I'm assuming you probably can't read, is a poem. And it says, I'm 19 years old and I have lived in the valley all my life. I don't see my family anymore. We used to get together as a family and cook dinner. They can't come over here. I used to see my grandparents in Reynosa, Tamaulipas every week, but since the violence, I haven't seen them. And there's some very deliberate line breaks there to emphasize some of those statements. These tapestries are a collaboration and mixed media. And the reason I brought them into this presentation, or this one and some other pieces of art, was to think about that creativity that can happen in situations of pain, and also in these polyvocalic, multicultural places where people are trying to express their realities. and to think about like, how can we value different kinds of expression? How can we allow different kinds of expression in our classrooms to deal with some of these experiences, but also to allow different voices to come in. One of the things, the border itself and all the experiences of the border can actually be like an exigence, right? For a reason to research, a reason to write, a reason to express. So that's one of the things that we can think about when we talk about borderedness, and inviting students to into our classrooms, essentially across the border, into these experiences. So to talk about just a few points in the chapters, and I'm throwing a few questions out here, and then I think we can open the floor up to go a little bit more Q&A maybe. Hinojosa and De Leon Zepeda talk about this polyvocality, this multivoicedness that I'm trying to discuss to represent their work, which is an amazing work. So I'm just giving it a little bit of a highlight, but they're talking about how you can try to bring out this multivoicedness to construct discursive spaces, places where people can speak and write, to reflect the complexity of identities we've been talking about, to reflect these bordered identities and these multifaceted identities. And so they talk about this in terms of first year writing, but one of the things we can think about is in your disciplines or classrooms, how do you think you could encourage this multivoicedness? If you think about their chapter in the way that it was written in these different voices, right? The very academic text, and then it's contrasted with the personal narratives, and it flips between the two authors speaking separately and speaking together. And so they're addressing very serious, theoretical, highly complex academic ideas, but they're also including the very personal memories, right? And those are set aside right next to each other. So it's both what they're saying, but it's also how they're saying it, and like whether that would be useful to you as possibly as future teachers and what you might be able to use with that. I'm going to go ahead and we can come back to any of these questions if they're of interest. Newman and Mendez, Newman and Garcia did the study of translingualism on the border. And it's a fascinating study of translingualism on the border and how people living on the border are functioning in these linguistic spaces and what their realities are in that reality. And they make a really interesting conversation about what translingualism is and how it is a rhetorical process that really reflects an intentional and innovative use of language of these people, how these people are being innovative and intentional and how they're using language in different sites and spaces and in classrooms and outside of classrooms. And so that is a fascinating piece of scholarship. And so one of the things that I was thinking we could talk about in relationship to the ideas that they bring up are these ideas of what languages and cultures are you encountering in your classroom? How do you think you could celebrate their diversities and their languages and experiences? In what ways can you resist deficit thinking when reading your students' writing? They talk about, because they both speak Spanish and English, how they can read the student's text, even writing in English, and recognize the Spanish, right? They can recognize the Spanish grammar forms, they can recognize the cultural references and the colloquialisms, even translated into English. Some of us are not that advantaged. I am not that advantaged. I am not bilingual. So for me, I would not be able to recognize that. So in what ways can I do some of these things without having that advantage, right? And then the last thing that you read this week, I think, was the Lang testimonial. And she talks about, yes, she talks about having her students doing reading and researching in their own home languages. She has a student who writes about the border and and she does research. She researches her topic in her first language, which is Spanish, and then writes about it in English. And she sort of has these questions looking back, like, how could I have done it better? In what ways was this successful? Was it not successful? And so I thought she raised some really interesting questions in her piece. So before I go on, let me go ahead and ask if there's any questions or responses. I can go back to some previous slides, but I'd like to get some discussion going a little bit and then take a few more minutes to talk before we completely close. So are there?
Oh yeah, there's a ton of questions.
Okay, let's have a conversation.
Okay, so the first question, since it's the one I just received, it's a student of mine from Alex. And Alex wants you to expand on the Gloria Anzaldúa quote, "If you really want to hurt me, talk badly about my language. I am my language," end quote. What do you think about this language personality theory? Thank you for that question, Alex.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. And I kind of want to know, what do you think it means?
Yeah, Alex, feel free to type that in there. What do you think that means? We've got a lot of questions, so while he's typing, I'll go back to some of the previous questions.
Okay.
We've got, because there's a lot.
Okay.
So, yeah, thank you. Okay, so if we think about listening as being on a par with speaking or writing and reading, what benefit is there could you talk about the benefits of that approach of rhetorical listening? What benefit might there be to expanding this rhetorical listening and reading, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think that the rhetorical listening can be very helpful in terms of thinking about who's speaking and what their purpose is, and what what is the goal or what is the exigence for that communication. And so that helps put things into context and give it more meaning. I think that is hopefully would help with communication and help with maybe being more inclusive of multiple voices.
Okay, now this is just a comment, but it is interesting that he says and obviously this is a teacher, one of our state SLOs in Comp 1 is quote unquote edited American English. Just a comment for you. An audience member, can you recommend an excellent novel for an English or some other classroom along the lines of what you're talking about?
Oh my gosh. I'm really bad at coming up with things on the spur of the moment. All right, let me think about that one.
Yeah, we can come back to that. That's not a big deal.
But
well,
I
it is a big deal. But
let me comment on the SLOs and the edited English.
Yeah,
I think this is a ongoing, and I'm going to go back to that thing that I said at the beginning about being a continuing learner. I think that as an English teacher, and then I broaden that out to all teachers, I think there's going to be a continuing tension in our practice, between not wanting to put people, not wanting to negatively judge home language, not wanting to criticize different varieties of English, and at the same time, and being inclusive, but at the same time, the other side of that coin, or the argument that's traditionally made, is students need to be able to function in standard English in order to get a job and do well in school and pass the TSI or the STAR or whatever it is, right? And one of the arguments that was made many, many years ago was if we withhold that knowledge, then we are, reenacting racism in a different way, and we are withholding tools from people, means of self promotion and advancement, that kind of thing. And so I think there's a really fine balance. And so my response for several years has been, well, we teach standard English, but we also provide opportunities for writing in other varieties, like in an informal, like a journal, whatever. Or right now I'm teaching a multi-genre assignment. And so I might say, well, in some genres, some varieties of English are appropriate, and other genres, other varieties of English are appropriate. They're all equal, but you have to recognize what fits with what. I think most recently, there is a pressure to cross those boundaries, to not accept those boundaries, to not say like, well, if I'm writing a paper for school, if I'm writing a conference presentation, it needs to be in standard English. I'm hearing more and more scholars and people who are colleagues in higher education using what would have been termed non-standard varieties of English in professional settings, because they're trying to push the boundaries, and they're saying, we're not going to accept that constraint. We're going to argue that I ought to be able to use my English wherever I want to. And so I think that sort of my previous answer, I'm still working on it, because I think we're all still working on it, So anyway, I don't want to only answer one question, but that's a hard one. It's a continuing issue.
Yeah. And just to clarify for everybody, what I meant by saying it's not a big deal about the novel, I meant that she didn't have to have the answer right at that moment. We still want to hear
so much. I'm like, oh my God, the pressure.
Yeah. Okay, so Alex has an answer to the language personality question. He says, in How to Tame a Wild Tongue, Ansel Dua talks about the Chicano people creating their own language and calls it an orphan tongue.
Mm-hmm.
I think that marginalized groups, in particular Chicano people, Alex says, really identify with our language because it gives us identity. As for the language personality theory, I'm a little lost and would like to hear your input on that.
Yeah, I don't know if I can add anything that would help you with your confusion. I feel like you're absolutely right, that there is a connection between language and identity, and the history, the specific history of Chicano people in not just in our country, but all over this hemisphere, right? And Ansel Dua does a great job of talking about those varieties and how people use them in connection to their identities. I think, yeah, so I don't know that I have a better explanation than what you already provided. I do think those things also aren't fixed. They evolve over time and in situations, and that's one of the things that she talks about, is how all that is also historical and it's also individual. And so it's very complex.
Okay, the next question is, how do we handle different quote unquote cognitive identities in a classroom?
I don't think I have an answer to that question.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah, I really don't. That's really difficult. I think it goes along the same lines, the same sort of a conversation of being as inclusive as possible educating ourselves as much as possible about kind of along the lines of universal design. Where are my blind spots? Because I am not a member of this, I don't have this kind of a thought pattern. I don't have this kind of a way of thinking. And so that you don't just build your own classroom to privilege people that are like you, but you try to find ways to include others. And I guess I'm thinking autism spectrum and things like that. I'm not sure that's what the question is
Well,
referring
no,
to.
not, I think I would offer, we had the Wall Street Journal writer Jason Riley on campus, well, not on campus, but virtually a couple of semesters ago. And Jason said that one of the things that discouraged him was he felt like Americans were not listening to each other. They were simply talking past each other. And Jason was saying that from a conservative standpoint, I think, and I do think there's a great deal to be said that we're not doing that well enough in our classrooms to really listen to the varied voices that exist, not just on autism spectrums or
Right, but political.
diversities, but political perspectives as well. Yeah. And it's hard to do. It's hard to listen to people that you don't agree with, but I think we've got to do that better. Okay,
it is.
Next question is, oh yes, here it is. What can we learn from other countries and how they have handled such issues?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure how much better off other countries are than the United States. And in fact, coming from Houston, I would say Houston is a leader in many, many things, including diversity and people living together. Don't assume that other countries are more inclusive than we are. Most countries have minority populations that are excluded from the structures of power. And, I think that they, you see stuff on television, let's say from the UK, and in some cases, I think their representation seem maybe a little bit more progressive than ours, but they've been a little bit ahead of us in decolonialize. I mean, they were a colonial power and now they're sort of a reduced power and they've had to deal with this shift. It wasn't easy for them either, and it's still a problem. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's the only answer I have.
There you go. The next one is a comment, but you can riff on this as you need or want. We read a novel on the Mexican Civil War and Saidia Hartman's Wayward Lives. This work introduced all sorts of linguistic identities and questions about language.
That's cool. Yeah. I'm still trying to think of a novel that I've got a couple, but I can't think of the authors or that kind of thing. So I'll steal your ideas.
Okay, let's see what else we got. Okay. Oh, here's a suggestion. The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's from Anna. Christina says, I encourage polyvocality in my English 1301 course through assignments such as literacy narratives. Some of my students have integrated different languages into their narratives. My students are also writing rhetorical analysis essays about works focusing on language, including Gloria Anzaldua's How to Tame a Wild Tongue and Amy Tan's Mother Tongue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that kind of goes to, I guess, the stuff I didn't get to talk about, which was the kind of the ideas for being inclusive. And I think Christina's right on the money with some of the things that we're doing, which also are literacy narratives where students research and write about their own histories. And I love to do a multi-generational one where they're researching their family's history with language and literacy over a couple generations. We read Deborah Brandt. She talks about the connections between literacies and economic advantage. And so how certain skills might be more valuable than others. So she talks about, for example, computer literacy back in I think it's the 90s. And one person who has the advantage of learning code early and is able to get in on the computer industry, and another person who's literacy is bilingualism and it's not valued, and she's not, she doesn't earn a high salary because they aren't valuing being bilingual in Spanish and English. Whereas the person who is bilingual in computer code and English has a significant economic advantage. One of the other things is the, the possibility, like I said, of doing multiple genres. So if students are writing website texts or something, or things that are more multimodal, sometimes they can include multiple varieties of language or multiple languages in those. So nursing students can write documents for patients with from different languages and those kinds of things.
This next question is from Anna.
Mm-hmm.
She says, there is value in being able to move within a variety of venues/environments. Do you think it's okay to write an email to a professor in the same language in which you would text your friends?
No, of course not. And that's where I would talk about rhetorical awareness and appropriateness. And I do think that that's an important element of teaching communication and writing, is talking about, what's appropriate and with what audience and with what, in what context. What I was saying is, I think some of those barriers are shifting as people of color or people with other varieties who speak other varieties of English or other languages are moving into positions of power where they're tenured and they can do certain things, or they have the position where they have the ability to do that. But yeah, no, I think that's a perfect opportunity to talk about rhetoric.
Okay, the next, I would say for everybody on Houston, I put a link in the chat box earlier from Stephen Kleinberg's Kinder Institute. And he has a book out that's come out in the last year or two called Prophetic City, about Houston. And it's really quite good. And I would recommend that as another book in addition to Dr. Murphy's. But I would recommend Stephen Kleinberg's book about that topic about Houston as kind of a bellwether or example of what American cities are going to look like more and more into the future. And I think the Wall Street Journal, maybe it was the Financial Times, had a piece within the last couple of weeks about Miami being the quintessential American city nowadays. So those are interesting things to think about too. Like, what is the quintessential American city, or is it Vegas, things like that. Okay, so I think this is really about the time we have is for the last question, which is, why is the term Latinx used when the more correct term is, I want to pronounce this correctly. Is it Latine or Latine? I apologize for my ignorance there.
Oh, that's okay. That was a choice that we talked about in the introduction, and I think it's an evolving situation, the way that these terms are used and the choices that people make for the terms that they're going to use. The term just using Latin as the root, even that is somewhat problematic, right? Because then you have this history of colonialism and coming from the Latin, it's still a Eurocentric kind of a term. Of course, Hispanic is the same way. So we chose Latinx because we thought it was more inclusive and recognized not only gender difference, but also different gender fluidity and different identities of gender that have recently sort of come into more awareness. That was our choice. I don't think we discussed the possibility of the AE ending. I don't remember that being part of our conversation, but it's an interesting thing to bring up, option. And there's many books.
A suggestion that just came in from the person who also asked that question said, then just call us indigenous.
Yeah, that's a possibility, but then there's mixed race people also. I mean, everyone is sort of, but yes, you're right. And some of the terms we tried to use what the authors of the chapters also were choosing to use. So the book isn't entirely 100% regular, right?
Okay. Well, that makes up the hour that we have, and I'd like to thank the audience for all their questions and for their good questions and for attending today. And Lone Star College and myself personally, Dr. Murphy, we would like to thank you for taking the time to speak with us today about this topic. And thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it.
Be sure to follow us on social media at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Like this video, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button to be notified about our latest content.